The air in the stable behind the Three Feathers Saloon was thick with the stench of sour whiskey, manure, and malevolent satisfaction. It clung to Jedediah Stone's sweat-soaked shirt as he leaned against a rough-hewn post, the world tilting on a drunken axis. Inside, the tinny piano and raucous laughter were a distant, irritating buzz, like flies on a fresh corpse. He wasn't here for the noise. He was here for the quiet oblivion at the bottom of a bottle, a place where the ghosts of his wife and son couldn't reach him. But tonight, there was no quiet. Instead, there was a sound, a soft rhythmic scrape of rope against wood. His bleary eyes struggled to focus in the gloom, lit only by a single sputtering lantern hanging from a rusty nail. And then he saw her. She was tied to a support beam in the farthest stall, the one usually reserved for the sheriff's prized stallion. A Comanche girl, no older than 17 summers, her dark hair matted with dirt and her deerskin dress torn at the shoulder. Her wrists were bound tight, the coarse rope already rubbing her skin raw. She didn't cry out or struggle. She sat with a stillness that was more profound than any scream, her gaze fixed on a crack in the wooden floor, as if it held the secrets to some other, better world. A wave of nausea, hot and bitter, rose in Jed's throat, and it had nothing to do with the whiskey. He'd seen that look before. The look of a soul that had retreated so far inside itself that the body was just an empty vessel waiting for the end. He saw it in the mirror every morning. A group of freight haulers had dragged her in an hour ago, boasting of their prize captured near the Cimarron River. They'd hooted and hollered, their boasts sloshing with liquor and casual cruelty, debating what they'd do with her before selling her off. The town sheriff, a bloated man named Brody with a perpetually greasy vest, had just laughed and told them to keep her out of sight until morning. "Don't damage the goods," he'd grunted, pocketing a silver dollar they'd tossed him. Jed's hand, calloused and scarred from years of ranching, closed around the hilt of the skinning knife on his belt. It was an instinct, a muscle memory from a life he thought he'd buried. He was a drunk, a ghost haunting the edges of a town that had long since written him off. He had nothing, no land left to his name, no family to protect. Intervening was suicide. They would beat him to death in this very stable, and no one would even bother to drag his body out for the undertaker. Staying hidden was the smart thing to do, the only thing to do. He took another swig from his flask, the liquor burning a familiar path down his chest. But tonight it offered no comfort. It only sharpened the image of the girl, superimposing it over memories of crackling embers and the scent of burning pine. A night sky turned orange with a fire that had consumed his world. The men inside were celebrating their power over a helpless creature. They saw a savage. Jed, in his drunken stupor, saw the spitting image of human dignity being ground into the dirt. And a voice, one he hadn't heard in 5 years, the voice of the man he used to be, whispered a single damning word: coward. The word cut through the alcoholic haze, sharper than any blade. He pushed himself off the post, his boots sinking into the filthy straw. His movements were unsteady, but his purpose was a sudden, cold point of steel in his gut. He didn't think about the next day. He didn't think about Sheriff Brody or the freight haulers. He only thought about the rope and the look in the girl's eyes. He stumbled into the stall. The girl flinched, her body tensing as his shadow fell over her. She finally looked up, her dark eyes wide with a fear so pure it was like a physical blow. But there was something else in them. 2. A flicker of defiance, a spark of spirit that hadn't been extinguished. He didn't say a word. Words were useless things, clumsy and full of lies. He knelt, the cheap whiskey making his head spin, and pulled his knife. The girl recoiled. "A small zakamai," choked gasp escaping her lips. She thought he was one of them, here to claim his share of the spoils. Jed ignored her fear. He reached behind her, his large, rough hand brushing against her back, and sawed at the ropes. The fibers were thick, and his hands trembled, but the blade was sharp. One strand popped, then another. With a final, ragged cut, the rope fell away. Her hands dropped to her lap, and she stared at her freed wrists, at the raw, red welts, as if she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. "Come on," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "Get up." He grabbed his horse, old Blackjack, from the next stall. The animal snorted, sensing the urgency. Jed threw a worn blanket over its back, not bothering with a saddle. He turned back to the girl. She was still on the ground, watching him, her face a mask of confusion and suspicion. He didn't have time to explain. He bent down, slid one arm under her legs and the other behind her back, and lifted her. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile collection of bones and sinew. He placed her on the horse's back and, with a grunt, swung himself up behind her. He grabbed the reins with one hand, his other arm instinctively wrapping around her waist to keep her from falling. She was rigid, a statue of terror in his grasp. With a kick of his heels, he spurred Blackjack toward the stable's rear opening, a dark rectangle that led to the alley and the vast, unforgiving plains beyond. The sounds of the saloon faded behind them, swallowed by the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the night wind. They were just two shadows melting into a greater darkness. A drunken rancher and a Comanche girl, bound together by an act of defiance that had just signed his death warrant. The weight of his decision was as real and solid as the girl leaning against his chest, and for the first time in years, Jedediah Stone felt something other than the dull ache of loss. He felt the sharp, terrifying clarity of being alive and hunted. The sun rose with the mercy of a branding iron, searing the horizon a violent orange and exposing the plains in all their stark, unforgiving beauty. Jedediah woke with a throbbing head and the taste of rust in his mouth. The whiskey had worn off, leaving behind the familiar companions of regret and a dull, pounding ache behind his eyes. He and the girl had ridden until Blackjack was slick with sweat, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the town of redemption. They'd stopped in a shallow ravine, hidden from the open prairie by a cluster of mesquite trees. The girl, Tala, was already awake. She sat a dozen paces away, her back to him, watching the sunrise. She hadn't said a word the entire night, not even when he'd offered her his canteen, which she'd accepted with a hesitant but grateful nod. Her silence was a wall, but it wasn't an empty one. It was filled with watchfulness, with a cautious intelligence that took in every detail of their surroundings. Jed pushed himself to his feet, his joints groaning in protest. He had to know how bad it was. He was a fool, a drunk who'd let a moment of conscience sentence them both to death. Brody wasn't a man to let an insult, or a piece of property, go. "Stay here," he grumbled, the words feeling foreign in his dry throat. He doubted she understood, but he pointed to the ground for emphasis. Her gaze followed him, unblinking, as he crept to the edge of the ravine and peered over the top. He scanned the horizon, his years of tracking cattle kicking in. He was looking for a dust cloud, the telltale sign of a posse. The plains were empty, for now. He knew a small, seldom-used trading post was a few miles north, a place where trappers and loners sometimes left messages. It was a risk, a terrible one, but ignorance was a greater danger. He told the girl, again using more gestures than words, that he was going and would be back. She simply watched him go, her expression unreadable. The ride was a torment of sun and self-recrimination. He kept to the low ground, his eyes constantly scanning his back trail. When he reached the trading post, a dilapidated shack with a leaning porch, it seemed deserted. He tethered Blackjack out of sight and approached on foot. Tacked to the main support beam, fluttering in the morning breeze, was a freshly printed sheet of paper. His heart hammered against his ribs. Wanted $200, dead or alive Jedediah. Stone for the abduction of a Comanche captive and theft of livestock. Property of the Red Dog Freight Company, considered armed and dangerous. Approach with extreme caution. Authorized by Sheriff J. Brody, Redemption. Jed stared at the words, the lie of them burning hotter than the sun. Abduction. Theft. Property. Brody had twisted his one decent act in 5 years into a crime. He wasn't a rescuer, he was a kidnapper. $200 was a fortune. It was enough to turn every farmer, bounty hunter, and desperate soul in the territory into his enemy. His name, already tarnished by grief and alcohol, was now that of a wanted man. He ripped the poster from the post, the paper crinkling in his trembling fist. When he returned to the ravine, Tala was exactly where he'd left her. She looked up as he approached, her eyes immediately falling to the paper in his hand. He didn't try to hide it. He smoothed it out on the dusty ground between them. She knelt and looked at the poster. She couldn't read the words, but she didn't need to. She saw the crude sketch of his face, the bold letters of his name, and the large dollar amount. A flicker of understanding, or perhaps something else, crossed her features. She looked from the poster to his face, then back again. Her finger traced the drawing, then moved to the word abduction. Jed expected to see fear, or accusation. He'd abducted her, just as the poster said. From her perspective, he was just another white man who had taken her, his motives unknown. But instead, her gaze was clear, searching. She looked at his worn-out boots, his calloused hands, the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes. Then she looked back at the poster, at the lie printed for all the world to see. Slowly, she shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement. She understood that the paper was a weapon, and it was aimed at them both. She pointed to the name J. Brody, then made a gesture, her hand mimicking a snake's forked tongue. She knew who the liar was. In that moment, the space between them shifted. They were no longer a man and his rescued captive. They were two fugitives, bound by a common enemy. An unspoken alliance was forged there in the dust, under the weight of a $200 lie. He was a man with a death sentence on his head, and she was a girl with no home to return to. Tala stood up and pointed to the east, where the sun was beginning to climb, then drew a line in the dirt with her foot, pointing west. She was telling him they were burning daylight. They had to move. Her pragmatism cut through his despair. For the first time, he saw her not as someone he had to protect, but as a partner in this desperate flight. He nodded, crumpling the wanted poster in his fist. He would keep it. It was a reminder of the cost of a single act of compassion. He stamped out the embers of their small, smokeless fire. The hunt was on, and as they mounted Blackjack and rode deeper into the wilderness, Jedediah felt the crushing weight of his past being replaced by the immediate, terrifying reality of their future. They were no longer just running from his ghosts, but from the very real threat of Brody's posse. For 2 days, they moved west, deeper into a landscape of cracked earth and towering rock formations that looked like the bones of ancient giants. The sun was a relentless hammer, and water became a currency more valuable than the gold men killed for. Jed pushed them hard, his fear a constant spur, but the wilderness was a more immediate and impartial threat than any posse. On the 3rd day, the sky turned a sickly shade of yellow-brown. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a menacing silence, "Storm's coming," Jed muttered, more to himself than to Tala. A bad one. He knew the signs. He'd seen dust storms strip the paint from a barn and bury a herd of cattle in less than an hour. Tala had seen it too. She was scanning the horizon. Her body tensed. She pointed towards a line of low-lying mesas, a dark scar in the distance. Shelter. There was no argument. They spurred the already exhausted blackjack into a desperate trot. The wind hit them first as a low moan, then as a physical wall of grit and sand. It tore at their clothes and stung their eyes. The world dissolved into a churning, brown chaos. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Jed could barely see the horse's ears. He relied on Tala, who leaned forward, her hand on Blackjack's neck, somehow guiding the animal through the blinding maelstrom with an instinct he couldn't fathom. Just when Jed thought their lungs would burst from the dust, they stumbled into the lee of a rock face. Tala slid off the horse and pulled at his arm, pointing to a dark fissure in the stone, the mouth of a cave, barely visible through the swirling sand. They scrambled inside, pulling the weary Blackjack in with them, just as the full fury of the storm broke. The sound was a deafening roar, as if the world were being scoured down to bare rock. Inside the cave. It was cool and blessedly still. It wasn't large, just a single chamber hollowed out by centuries of wind and water. But it was sanctuary. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they took stock. They were alive. For now. That was enough. As twilight fell, the storm still raged outside, a constant, howling reminder of their fragility. Jed managed to start a small fire with the few pieces of dry scrub brush they'd found near the entrance. The flames pushed back the oppressive darkness, casting flickering shadows on the cave walls. The warmth was a comfort, a small pocket of civilization in the heart of the wild. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, sharing the last of their dried jerky. The silence between them was different now, less about suspicion and more a shared exhaustion. The storm had stripped away everything but the essential. In the firelight, Jed noticed a gash on his forearm, a long, bloody scrape from a thorny branch he'd blundered into during their mad dash for shelter. It was caked with dirt, before he could even think to clean it. Tala was moving. She went to the back of the cave and came back with a handful of pale green leaves he didn't recognize, which she'd apparently spotted when they first entered. She crushed them between two stones, creating a damp, fragrant poultice. She knelt in front of him, her expression serious, and gestured to his arm. He hesitated for a moment. The intimacy of the act felt dangerous, a breach of the careful distance he'd maintained. But he saw the quiet competence in her eyes and relented, holding out his arm. Her touch was surprisingly gentle as she cleaned the wound with a strip of cloth torn from her own hem, wetted with their precious water. As she applied the poultice, her fingers brushed against his skin. It was the first human touch he'd allowed himself in years that wasn't violent or transactional. It sent a jolt through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. As she worked, her gaze drifted from the fresh cut up his arm to his chest, where his shirt had been torn open. In the dancing firelight, a thick, puckered scar was visible, running from his collarbone down his ribs. It was an ugly thing, an old wound from a blade meant to kill. Tala's fingers stopped their work. She looked at the scar, her eyes wide with a question she could not speak. It was a map of a violent history, a story written on his flesh. Jed flinched, not from her touch, but from the memory the scar always carried. He instinctively moved to cover it, the old shame rising like bile. The fire, the darkness, the sudden intimacy. It all conspired to pull the memory from the depths where he kept it buried. The memory of the night his ranch burned, of the fight in the dark, of a knife flashing and the searing pain that had preceded the utter blackness of his failure. He didn't offer an explanation. He couldn't. But in the quiet of the cave, with the storm howling its rage outside, he didn't have to. She looked from the brutal scar on his chest to the deep, invisible wounds in his eyes, and she understood. She understood that his past was as violent and relentless as the storm they had just escaped. She finished tending his arm, her movements slow and deliberate. Then she retreated back to her side of the fire, leaving him alone with his ghosts. But something had changed. The scar, a mark of his greatest shame, had been seen. And in her gaze, he hadn't seen judgment or revulsion. He had seen a quiet, solemn recognition. In the flickering heart of their shelter, a piece of his carefully guarded darkness had been brought into the light, and he had survived the exposure. The fragile trust between them, born of a lie on a wanted poster, was now being cemented by the truth of a scar. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world scrubbed clean and unnaturally quiet. The air was cool and crisp, but the reprieve was short-lived. As Jed scouted from the mouth of the cave, he saw it, far in the distance, but unmistakable. A column of dust, too organized, too deliberate to be the wind. The posse. The storm had hidden their tracks, but it hadn't stopped Brody. If anything, it had only made him more determined. "They're coming," Jed said, stepping back into the cave. Tala needed no further explanation. She was already packing their meager belongings. The fear was back, a cold knot in Jed's stomach. But it was different now. It was sharper, clearer. It wasn't just his life on the line. "This way," he said, pointing to the rugged mesas behind the cave. "It's hard country, slows down a posse on horseback. We can lose them in the canyons." For the first time, Tala questioned him. She shook her head and pointed in a slightly different direction, toward a stretch of land that looked flatter, more exposed. Jed frowned. "No, that's suicide. They'll see us for miles," she insisted, grabbing a handful of reddish dust from the cave floor and letting it trickle through her fingers. Then she pointed to Blackjack's hooves and then to the flatlands. It took Jed a moment to understand. The ground there was hardpan, baked clay and rock. It held fewer tracks than the softer earth in the canyons. It was a gamble. They would be more visible, but they would leave less of a trail for Brody's best tracker to follow. It was her world, her knowledge against his. He thought of how she had guided them through the storm, and he made a decision. He nodded. "All right. Your way." The dynamic between them had changed. It was no longer Jed leading and Tala following. It was a partnership, a tense collaboration of two desperate survivors. His knowledge of the general territory and her intimate understanding of the land's secrets became their single, combined weapon. The day was a grueling blur of motion and vigilance. They moved at a punishing pace, pushing Blackjack to the limit. Jed took the lead when navigating the rocky climbs, his rancher's instincts telling him the safest paths. But in the open, Tala's senses were supreme. She would signal for them to halt, her head cocked, listening for sounds on the wind that he couldn't hear. Once, she pulled them into a thicket of greasewood a full minute before the posse appeared on a distant ridge, their forms small and menacing against the skyline. They watched, hearts pounding, as the riders paused, scanning the horizon, before choosing the wrong direction and disappearing from view. Her survival skills were a quiet revelation. She showed him how to find water, a seep hidden at the base of a rock face, by watching the flight path of a lone hawk. She chewed on a piece of a bitter root that he would have ignored, and a few hours later, he saw that her energy was restored while his own was flagging. They were a study in contrasts. He was the product of a world of fences and property lines, of brute force and clear-cut rules. She was a creature of the open land, of subtle signs, of listening and adapting. Their communication remained mostly unspoken, a language of gestures and shared glances that became more fluid and efficient with every passing hour. A touch on the arm meant stop. A certain look in his eyes conveyed how much farther. A nod from her was all the reassurance he needed. Late that afternoon, with the posse having fallen farther behind, they risked a brief rest in the shadow of an overhanging ledge. Jed passed her the canteen. Their hands brushed. And this time, neither of them pulled away. The shared danger had burned away the awkwardness, leaving a raw, essential connection. He watched her as she drank, her profile etched against the harsh landscape. He realized he didn't even know her name, yet he was trusting her with his life. "Tala," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. She pointed to herself. It was the first word she had spoken to him. It sounded like the land itself, elemental and strong. "Jedediah," he replied, pointing to his chest. He felt a foolish grin touch his lips, a ghost of an expression he hadn't worn in years. She tried the name, her tongue stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables. "Jeddah." She settled on that, a small smile finally reaching her eyes. The moment was fleeting. The shadow of the posse was a constant pressure, a reminder that their lives were measured in the distance between them and their hunters. But in that brief exchange, in the sharing of names, they had ceased to be abstracts to one another. They were Tala and Jedediah, a Comanche girl and a wanted rancher. And together, they were still alive, their combined skills and burgeoning trust their only shield against the relentless pursuit that shadowed their every step. They mounted up and rode on, the weight of his name and the hope in hers hanging in the air between them. They found the homestead at dusk. It wasn't a destination. It was something they stumbled upon while following a dried-up creek bed, a place that time and man had tried to erase. All that remained was a single, defiant chimney stack of river stone, rising like a tombstone against the bruised purple sky. A few charred timbers lay scattered where the walls of a small cabin once stood. The place radiated a profound and terrible silence. Jed pulled Blackjack to a halt, his body going rigid, his breath caught in his throat. He knew this place. He knew the way the creek curved just so, the way the cottonwood trees grew in a small, protective cluster. This was it. The place he saw every time he closed his eyes. His home. "No," he whispered, the word a ragged plea. He hadn't been back in 5 years, had actively avoided this quadrant of the territory as if it were plagued. But their desperate flight had led them straight into the heart of his own personal hell. Tala slid off the horse, her eyes full of concern as she watched him. He barely noticed. He dismounted on unsteady legs, moving like a sleepwalker toward the ruins. The air grew cold, thick with the ghosts of memory. He saw it not as it was, but as it had been, a sturdy cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, smoke curling from the chimney, the sound of his wife Sarah's laughter mingling with the squeals of his 5-year-old son. Daniel. His boot struck something half buried in the dirt. He bent down and brushed away the dust. It was a small, wooden rocking horse. Its paint faded. One of its rockers splintered. He'd carved it for Daniel's 5th birthday. His fingers traced the smooth, worn wood, and the carefully constructed dam around his memory shattered. The past came rushing back in a tidal wave of smoke and terror. It wasn't a neat, orderly recollection, but a chaotic storm of sensory fragments. The smell of kerosene. The night sky lit an unholy orange. The guttural yells of men, white men, their faces smeared with crude paint to look like warriors. He remembered the thunder of their horses, the shattering of the window. He'd grabbed his rifle, told Sarah to take Daniel and hide in the root cellar. The man who burst through the door was big, with a cruel, sneering face and a jagged scar above his eyebrow. Jed had seen him before, working for a wealthy land baron who wanted Jed's property for its water rights. Jed had refused to sell. Now they had come to take it. He fired his rifle, dropping one of them, but the big man was on him, a knife flashing. The searing pain in his side, the one that had left the scar Tala had tended, was as real now as it had been then. He'd fought, but there were too many. A heavy boot connected with his head, and the world went black. When he woke, it was to a horrifying silence. The cabin was an inferno. He'd crawled out, screaming their names, his voice raw, his body a canvas of agony. He'd clawed at the cellar door, but a heavy, burning beam had fallen across it. He was too weak, the fire too hot. He had failed. He had laid there, helpless, listening to the roar of the flames that had become his family's funeral pyre. The town, led by then-Deputy Brody, had accepted the story the raiders had planted. A Comanche raid. Brody had been the one to find him, delirious and burned, and had sympathetically declared it another savage attack. Jed, broken and consumed by a guilt so profound it felt like a physical sickness, had never corrected him. How could he? He, the man who was supposed to protect them, had been beaten and left for dead. The shame of his survival, of his failure, was a poison he'd chosen to numb with whiskey for 5 long years. He had let the lie stand, and in doing so, had let the Comanche people bear the blame for a crime committed by his own kind, by Brody's kind. A gut-wrenching sob tore from Jed's chest, the sound of a pain that had been festering for half a decade. He collapsed to his knees, clutching the small wooden horse, the carefully built walls of his stoicism crumbling into dust. Tala had watched the entire scene unfold, her silence a respectful witness to his immense grief. She didn't know the details, the names, or the reasons, but she recognized the language of loss. It was a language her own people knew all too well. She walked over to him, not with pity, but with a quiet strength. She knelt beside him in the ashes of his former life and placed a hand on his trembling shoulder. Her touch was an anchor in the storm of his memory. He looked up, his face streaked with tears and dirt, and saw her. He saw not a Comanche, not a captive, not a fugitive, but a person who understood sorrow. In that moment, he realized the depth of his cowardice. He had hidden behind a bottle while an entire people were slandered for a crime he knew they hadn't committed. His act of saving her in the stable hadn't just been about her. It had been a desperate, unconscious attempt to atone for a sin he had never dared to name. "It wasn't your people," he choked out, the words tearing at his throat. It was white men. Disguised. She just held his gaze, her dark eyes reflecting the dying light of the sky. She didn't need to understand his words to comprehend his confession. He had carried this ghost for 5 years. Now, in the ruins of his past, with a Comanche girl as his only witness, Jedediah Stone finally spoke the truth into existence. The weight on his soul didn't vanish, but for the first time, it felt bearable. The revelation at the homestead had changed Jed. The guilt was still there, a hot coal in his gut, but the shame that had paralyzed him for so long had burned away, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. His flight was no longer just about survival. It was about justice, but justice required strength, and they were at their limit. They were low on food, and Blackjack was starting to favor a front leg. They needed a safe harbor, if only for a night. Jed's mind turned to Silas Croft, an old acquaintance from before the fire. Silas ran a small, isolated ranch nestled in the Cuchillo Hills, far from the main trails. Silas was a gruff, solitary man who kept to himself and harbored a deep distrust of authority. If anyone would help a man on the run from Sheriff Brody, it would be him. It was a risk, but it was the only one they had left. They arrived at the Croft Ranch 2 days later, near midnight, guided by a single lamp burning in the main house. The place was quiet, the only sound the nervous stamping of their horse. Jed dismounted and approached the porch, telling Tala to wait with Blackjack, hidden in the shadows of a cottonwood. He knocked on the heavy wooden door. After a long moment, it creaked open to reveal a stooped figure holding a shotgun. "Who is it?" Silas Croft squinted into the darkness, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. "It's me, Silas. Jed Stone." Silas lowered the shotgun slightly, his eyes widening in surprise, then suspicion. "Stone? Heard you were wanted. $200 worth of wanted." "The poster's a lie, Silas," Jed said, his voice low and urgent. "Brody's behind it. I need help. Just a night's rest, some food, for me and a companion." Silas stared at him for a long, calculating moment. He glanced out into the darkness where Tala was hidden, then back at Jed's desperate face. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Get in, before you bring the whole damned territory down on my head." The relief that washed over Jed was so powerful it almost buckled his knees. Inside, Silas gave them a hot meal of beans and stale bread, the best food they'd had in a week. He asked few questions, and Jed offered few details. The gruff rancher seemed to respect his silence. He showed them to a small room in the back of the house. "You can have this," he grunted, "but be gone before sunup. I ain't looking for trouble." Jed thanked him profusely. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. He and Tala entered the small, sparse room. There was only one cot. Jed took the floor without a word. As he lay down, the exhaustion of the past week hit him like a physical blow. He was asleep almost instantly. He woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of low voices from the other room. Sunlight was streaming through a crack in the door. It was well past dawn. A cold dread washed over him. They should have been gone hours ago. He sat up, grabbing his gun belt. Tala was already awake, her body tense, her eyes wide with alarm. She put a finger to her lips, her gaze fixed on the door. Jed crept to the door and listened. It was Silas's voice, and another one that made his blood run cold. "Sheriff Brody." "Told you he'd come here," Brody was saying, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Every hunted dog eventually runs to a familiar den. $200, Silas. You'll get every cent once I have him in cuffs." "The girl's in there with him," Silas said, his voice betraying a hint of greed. "She worth anything extra?" "She's property. Just keep him talking." Betrayal. The taste was bitter. Worse than any whiskey. Silas had sold them out. Jed looked at Tala, a silent apology in his eyes. Her expression wasn't one of fear, but of fierce, cold resolve. There was no escape through the door. There was one small window, overlooking a narrow alley between the house and the barn. It was their only chance. "Get ready," Jed whispered. He kicked open the door, firing a single shot over Brody's head to send him diving for cover. "Tala, the window, go." As she scrambled towards the window, one of Brody's deputies burst in from the side, grabbing her. Jed turned to help, but Silas was there, bringing the butt of his shotgun down on Jed's shoulder, sending him sprawling. Pain exploded in his arm. Brody was back on his feet, a triumphant sneer on his face. "It's over, Stone. You should have just stayed a drunk." But they had both made the same mistake. They had all underestimated the girl. Tala didn't scream or struggle helplessly. As the deputy fumbled to restrain her, she moved with the speed of a striking snake. She twisted, bringing her knee up hard into his groin. As he doubled over with a gasp, she grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the nearby stove and swung it with all her might, cracking it against the side of his head. He dropped like a stone. The room was stunned into silence for a fraction of a second. That was all she needed. She didn't run for the window. Instead, she darted toward the hearth, where a pot of coffee was boiling over the fire. She grabbed the pot by its wooden handle and, with a defiant cry, flung the scalding liquid straight at Sheriff Brody. He roared in agony and fury, stumbling back, clawing at his face and chest. In that moment of chaos, Tala ran to Jed, helping him to his feet. His left arm was useless, but he could still run. They burst out the back door as Silas stood frozen in shock, his loyalty bought for a price that was now being paid in screams. They raced for the barn, for the horses, the sheriff's pained and furious curses echoing behind them. Tala had just saved them both, not with weakness or pleas, but with a fierce, unexpected, and brutal capacity for survival. The hunted had just bared her teeth. They escaped the ranch with 2 of Silas's horses, the sounds of chaos and Brody's pained howls fading behind them. Jed's shoulder was a blaze of agony, and his heart pounded with a mixture of adrenaline and awe. He had seen Tala as a victim, then as a partner, but in that smoke-filled kitchen, he had seen a warrior. She had not only saved him, she had shattered the last of his misconceptions. They rode hard for half a day, putting as much distance as they could between them and the betrayed sanctuary. They finally stopped in a narrow, winding canyon, its high rock walls providing a defensible position. Jed slid from his horse, his face pale with pain. Tala was immediately at his side, her expression a mixture of concern and grim determination, as she tended to his dislocated shoulder, forcing it back into place with a sickening pop that made him cry out. Jed looked at her. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a hardened resolve that mirrored his own. He was done running. The confrontation at Silas's ranch, the truth at his old homestead, it had all led to this. Running would only mean a lifetime of looking over his shoulder. It would mean Brody's lie would become the official story, and the truth of what happened to his family would remain buried forever. "No more," he said, his voice raspy. "I'm not running anymore." Tala watched him, her dark eyes searching his. She understood. She nodded once, a sharp, definitive gesture. They would face what was coming, together. Jed knew this canyon. He'd tracked stray cattle through its twists and turns for years. He knew its dead ends, its hidden passages, its treacherous footing. It would be their battlefield. It was time to stop being the hunted and become the hunter. They spent the rest of the day preparing. It wouldn't be a battle of bullets. Jed had only a few rounds left for his pistol. It would be a battle of wits. They set traps, a tripwire made of vine that would send a cascade of loose rocks down a narrow pass, a false trail leading to a sheer drop. Tala used her knowledge to camouflage their position, using mud and leaves to break up their outlines until they blended seamlessly with the canyon walls. The posse arrived late the next afternoon. Jed and Tala watched from a high ledge as Brody, his face red and blistered from the coffee, led 5 men into the mouth of the canyon. His rage had made him reckless. The first trap worked perfectly. As the posse navigated a tight bend, one of the lead horses hit the wire. The clatter of falling rocks sent the posse into chaos. Horses panicked. One rider was thrown, and their neat formation was broken. In the confusion, Jed fired a single shot, not at a man, but at a rock face high above them. The ricochet screamed through the canyon, making it sound like they were surrounded by multiple shooters. "They're up high! Spread out!" Brody yelled, his voice echoing off the walls. It was exactly what Jed wanted. A posse was dangerous, scattered. Frightened men were manageable. One by one, they used the canyon to their advantage. They led 2 deputies down a path that ended in thick, impassable brush, forcing them to abandon their horses and circle back, wasting time. They separated another from the group, and Jed, appearing like an apparition from behind a boulder, disarmed him without firing a shot. "Go home," Jed ordered the terrified man. "This isn't your fight." The man fled. Finally. It came down to Brody and his most loyal deputy. Jed led them deeper into the canyon, to a place he'd chosen carefully, a small box-like enclosure with only one way in. He waited. When Brody and his man rode in, their guns drawn, they found Jed standing alone in the center of the clearing. Tala was hidden, her role in this final act not yet played. "It's over, Stone," Brody snarled, his burned face twisting into a mask of hate. "Nowhere left to run." "I'm not running." "Brody," Jed said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm here to tell the truth. About my family." He began to speak, his voice ringing with the clarity of a man with nothing left to lose. He told the story of the raid, of the land baron, of the men disguised to look like warriors. He spoke of the fire, of the cellar, of the lie Brody had helped create and perpetuate. The deputy began to look uneasy, shifting his gaze from Jed to his sheriff. "What's he talking about, Sheriff?" "He's delirious," Brody spat, raising his pistol. "He's a madman and a kidnapper." "Am I?" Jed called out. "Or are you a murderer?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished object. It was a silver concho, intricately carved, one he'd pried from the saddle of the man he'd shot that night 5 years ago, right before being knocked unconscious. He'd kept it, not knowing why. "This fell off one of your raiders' saddles, an unusual design. I saw a matching one on your saddle in town just last week." At that moment, Tala emerged from the rocks behind Brody, silent as a mountain cat. In her hands, she held the deputy's horse's reins. She hadn't harmed the man. She had simply crept up and taken control of his mount, leaving him stranded. Her sudden appearance, a testament to her skill, was the final piece of the puzzle. The deputy, seeing the concho, hearing the conviction in Jed's voice, and witnessing the Comanche girl's silent power, finally understood. He had been following a liar and a killer. He slowly lowered his gun. "Drop it, Brody," the deputy said. "Let's take him in and let the circuit judge sort it out." Dai, seeing his support crumble. Brody's facade of authority vanished, replaced by pure, snarling rage. He fired at Jed, but Jed was already moving, diving behind a rock as the shot echoed through the canyon. The final reckoning had come. It wasn't about a grand shootout. It was about one broken man, empowered by truth, facing another, consumed by his lies. Jed stood, his own gun finally raised, his aim steady. He didn't have to kill him, he just had to win. His name wouldn't be cleared by bullets, but by the truth that was now, finally, free. The West is a land of harsh judgments and long memories. Sheriff Brody was taken into custody by his own deputy. The silver concho and the man's eventual testimony enough to see him hang for the murder of the Stone family. The bounty on Jedediah was rescinded, his name cleared in the eyes of the law, though the whispers in town would follow him for years. But Jed no longer cared for the opinions of townfolk. He had faced his ghosts and found that they were smaller and far less terrifying than the guilt he had carried. He and Tala did not stay in redemption. They headed north, toward the high country, where the air was cleaner and the land was vast enough to hold the promise of a new beginning. They found a small, abandoned plot of land by a clear-running stream, nestled in a valley of aspen trees. Using the skills he had as a builder and the knowledge she had of the earth, they began to construct a new life from the ashes of their old ones. There was a quiet rhythm to their days, a language built not of words, but of shared work and mutual respect. He taught her how to build a dovetailed corner for their new cabin. She taught him which plants could heal and which could sustain. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, watching the stars emerge in the immense, silent sky. Sometimes, he would take out the small, wooden rocking horse, the only relic he had saved from his past, and work on mending its broken rocker. It was not a monument to his loss, but a promise for a future where a home could be built again. Theirs was not a story of grand passion, but of something deeper and more resilient, a bond forged in injustice, tempered in flight, and solidified in a shared vision of peace. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest act of redemption is not about forgetting the past, but about having the courage to build a new life despite it.